Willkommen bei den Europäischen Literaturtagen 2017. Begegnungen mit Literatur, Begegnungen in der Wachau. Vom 16. bis 19. November treffen sich bereits zum 9. Mal internationale Autoren und Literaturexperten hier im Klangraum Minoritenkirche Krems sowie im Schloss zu Spitz an der Donau, um neue Bücher vorzustellen und sich aus ihren literarischen Blickwinkeln über drängende Fragen unserer Gegenwart auszutauschen. Als unsere Gegenwart begann. Die schwedische Journalistin Elisabeth Åsbrink und der russische Schriftsteller Sergej Lebedew schreiben beide hochaktuelle Bücher, in deren Mittelpunkt die Geschichte Europas seit dem Zweiten Weltkrieg steht. Das Gespräch der beiden über die Wurzeln unserer Gegenwart moderiert Karl Henrik Fredriksen.
Yes, we will conduct this talk in English. It's also not the usual book presentation. There are two writers, two protagonists on this stage. That means, for one, that there are two temperaments, two languages, two people, and in order to make use of that, instead of seeing it as a problem, I think we want to try to get this as dynamic as possible, to get a talk between these two writers, instead of just presenting their books. We will do that as well, but I hope that the emphasis will be on the talk. On my left is Elisabeth Åsbrink. She just brought out a book in German translation called 1947. It came out in Sweden last year, in summer. It's her fourth book, third. Her first book she wrote about the performance of a play directed by one of Sweden's most well-known playwrights, Lars Norén, and this was staged in a prison, and it ended with the killings of policemen, two policemen in Malexander in Sweden. The second book, which is also translated into German, was about a young Jewish boy called Otto, who lived at Löwengasse in Vienna, and was one of the children from Vienna that were sent to Sweden, and thereby saved from the Holocaust. In Sweden, he got to know, among other people, Ingvar Kamprad, the founder and owner of IKEA. And this book is based on letters from his parents to Otto, his parents who later were killed in Auschwitz. And the last book, which we will talk more about later, is just out in German translation, and just this week, actually, also in English translation. The books, these books will be available later today at the book table, I've been informed. This is the English edition of Elisabeth's book. Sergej Lebedev, on my right, has so far published 4 novels. None of them, though, in Russian, they're actually meanwhile all 4 are published. It took a while, though, before the first one was actually published. It first had to be published in German. And it's just now out in Russian as well. Two of them have been translated also into English. Oblivion was the first one, and the second one, The Year of the Comet. Oblivion was last year by the Wall Street Journal named one of the most important works of fiction of the year on their best 10 list. Three of his books are translated into German. Two, Menschen im August and
Der Himmel auf ihren Schultern.
Yeah, Himmel auf ihren Schultern. More will follow, and he's just now, also a couple of weeks ago, was translated into Swedish, and Italian is upcoming, and so on. So, widely translated authors at the stage. I would like to start in the topic of the festival, or of these literature days. I knew that this would happen. It was not good. It was the metal. It was not my strength. So, Angst, fear. You write, Sergei, in your text for this festival about your country of birth, about Russia, and about how fear was an integral part of Soviet Russia, but has become also an integral part of contemporary Russia. Soviet Russia, because the difference between reality, lived reality, and image was too big. The image was one of bravery, heroism, while each and every Soviet citizen had to deal on an everyday basis with fear. Why is contemporary Russia characterized by fear?
I would say that the late Soviet Union was the country of the light and predictable fear. So you had some kind of guidelines of the fear. And you knew that if you are following these guidelines, nothing will happen. It was regular, institutionalized, and predictable. But what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed? It was like different fears emerged which were absolutely irrational. And the general was the fear of terror, because the violence in the Soviet Union was the monopoly of the state, absolute monopoly of the state. And when suddenly, during the first Chechen campaign, Russian citizens understood that there is no more monopoly for the violence, and you can be killed just randomly on the street, this was the type of fear they never was prepared to. This was something you had no idea of. And I think that in this case, all my fellow countrymen said, okay, but we need the previous type of fear. We need to go back. We need this regularity, but not this absurdity.
You also suggest that it has to do with not acknowledging the guilt and the fear of previous generations, that therefore by not bringing this fear up in the open, it's there and working in each and every person, and above all structuring society. And thereby it's also influencing the rest of the world. You describe Russia as a contagious fear. It's contagion Europe with its fear. Could you develop that just a little?
I would say that even the Soviet dissidents were using the strategies of avoiding, but not the open fighting or the struggling. the strategy was to avoid the conflict, to avoid the open discussion of anything. So when the new Russian state was established, even the dissidents were against the idea that we should have some kind of trial of the past. We should judge this past in terms of morale and in terms of real juridical measures. So this was the key moment where the transmission of fear wasn't cut. And of course, it's very easy now for the Russian government or the Russian state to use the fears of the past again, because Russia really touched every country in Europe, and touched in a very cruel way. I do remember the European Writers' Conference in Berlin, where all the European countries were represented, and I was speaking with my fellow colleagues, with my writers, and I understood that every second person have in their family heritage something related to Russia, and something badly related to Russia. And of course, people also do remember this harm. They do remember the danger which is coming from the east, to be honest. And it's very easy now to orchestrate this again, just to pinpoint these painful things, and just to maybe lampoon them, or maybe to underline, okay, you're still afraid of us. And this is, I think, the conscious strategy of the moment, and it will be just going further and further, because instead of, open military conflict, they will employ this ideological or propaganda measures. It costs not as much, but affects maybe even worse.
But one way of addressing this underlying fear and also the crimes of the past is perhaps not to call for trials and legal justice, but to recognize what has actually been happening. And this is also what you do in all your books, actually. You try to find a language that can transport this experience of fear, even if it's just as here a closed down camp for prisoners in Menschen
in August.
People of August. Yeah. This is what you're doing as well, Elisabeth, trying to find a language that can transport situations characterized by fear, but also by horror, by tragedy. And starting somewhere else, you came to writing quite late. You were a journalist, worked for television. You're now working for radio. Not at all anymore. You stopped that. But you started to write books quite late. And
10 years ago.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And somewhere you talked about how difficult it was to get to that point, to dare to overcome that fear of actually penetrating something so much that you found a language to carry this.
Well, actually, I was very afraid of being mediocre. You know, I'm very, what do you say, högmodig? What's the good English word for that?
Highly pretending?
No, it's...
Yeah, hybris. I don't want to be mediocre, so I didn't write books because I was afraid they wouldn't be good enough. That's a very powerful force, not daring to fail. So, but I came to a point 10 years ago when I just said, to hell with it. If I fail, I fail. And I started writing. So. That's the short story.
That's the short story. But you did also find the language for this, for these very different. The three books that you've written are very different. One is describing this whole very contemporary scene with alive people. The second one, based on these letters, almost has a kind of a fiction character. It's written with the means of a novelist. You use, both in structure and in language, the means of a novelist, but it's all based on fact, as the saying is called. This new book is not like that one. Well, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, you're wrong.
I'm wrong, okay. Because my impression is that it's using the elements of fiction, but the language is a different one. The structure is much more cut up, it's fragments. And
well, also to put it short, I write non-fiction, but I wanted to see if I could find another kind of language for non-fiction. And I read a lot of non-fiction and I read a lot of poetry. I'm not a very good fiction reader, so my question to myself was, are these two languages combinable? Can one do research? I'm an investigative journalist as a start. Can one get facts checked and checkable, but transmit them into a poetic language, because they then reach the reader in another way, another center of the brain, I imagine. So that was my question, and each book is a way of answering that question. Does this work? Does this work? But of course this is more fragmentized because it was based on the way that I found the year. I was doing research, planning to do another book, and in order to do the other book, I was reading newspapers from this year, 1947, from day 1 to day 365, and the reality reaches you in fragments, as they do in journalism, and without, you don't know how it'll all end. So I wanted to capture that feeling.
And the book it consists of these fragments. Right? There are it's divided and it's structured by month. So it goes chronologically from day 1 to day 365. And during this year, you trace back the origins of a lot of the conflicts, a lot of what we experience today started back in 1947.
A lot of fear and a lot of hope.
A lot of fear and a lot of hope. The fear would be, for example, the Middle Eastern conflict, which starts back then in 1947. Hope would be the battle cry of never again of the European unification process. And the
idea of the universalism going through us, that all begins in 1947, for instance, with Eleanor Roosevelt getting the job to create universal human rights. That has never existed before in human history, that every person should have rights just because she is born. So there's a lot of the rebuilding of the West, I would say, most of it is going on, a new moral ground for us to stand on, but also the creation of what we today fear.
And also naming what was, I mean, the genocide, for example, the coining of that phrase starts there. Or Simone de Beauvoir, this is one could think of a fringe occurrence in this book, but it's actually in the very middle of it. Simone de Beauvoir, who writes to her American lover and big love in her life, more or less the same time as she starts to write The Second Sex, and two very different approaches that these are, but that are part of one life.
Yeah. Well, that's why I love the Simone de Beauvoir part of this, because she is a very strong intellectual thinking person, and at the same time she is completely dedicated to both the love and the man in a way that first irritated me immensely when I read these letters. But then I saw the great picture of her, that she is actually all of this. She contains it all, and I admire her for that. And then, yeah, there's so many things we could talk about.
Yeah, but these are examples of these fragments that of big events, starting as small initiatives, but turning out to be big events. But there's one part of this book which is not that, which is more of what the book about Otto, which is called, I think in German, I'm not sure about the exact quote now, und in Wienerwald stehen die Bäume immer noch. I think that's roughly the title. So there's one part of this book which is just that, which is it's telling a story, but that story is very close to you. Yes. I would actually ask you now to read that passage or an excerpt from it.
Okay.
And if you want to introduce it in
yes. Well, I didn't plan to write about myself or my family, but when I did research about this year, I had to ask myself, where was my father this particular year? He was 10 years old, 1947, and I realized when I found out more that this was also a decisive year in my family history. So there's a part of this book which is about me, my Hungarian father, and the family history. And I will read some short pieces, make a jump in the middle. I think that's all I need to say about that.
Yes.
Once there was a woman called Alice Hoffman, the mother of my father's mother. There is a photograph from the 1910s that show her in her high-necked white dress, a very young woman, photographed in profile. Her hair looks like mine. Her face reminds me of mine as it was in my 20s. She was born the 29th of April, like me. Alice Hoffman from Budapest married Béla Volak, and they had a daughter, Lily. She was an only child who lost her mother at the age of 4. When gentle Alice died of dysentery after drinking unpasteurized milk. I wish I could talk to my grandmother Lily about the early years of her life, which were hard and lonely. But once we held each other's hands and danced round and round to music, I recall. Other than that, I have little experience of having a family. There is nothing but names, rain falling over names, names falling through the generations. Alice, Lily, and the boy who would become my father. He was given the same name as his father, although this was not customary, and no one can explain why. I tried to assemble the year 1947 into a splintered whole. This is lunacy, but time does not leave me alone. Thanks.
This is what I was referring to before. Several times, actually, in this book, you confront yourself with yourself writing, trying to find this language, and we will come back to that. This is also something that I experience. It's there for me when I read your books, Sergei, that you're trying to find the language for an experience that has not been told, and this language it's the language. Somewhere you refer to it as the language of the North. You're searching for traces in this vast northern landscape, which is just as much a geographical place as it is a place in time, a history.
And a mental state.
Absolutely, a mental state. And it's also, later this afternoon, Andrzej Staszuk, the Polish writer, will be here. He wrote a book called Osten in German, the East. And that East is not just a geographical place, it's also a mental state. How do you go about that, finding that language for...
Since there are two investigative journalists on the stage today, but what helped me in investigation is my geological experience, because geology as a science is, I think, the most interesting detective story in the world. Because something happened, 400 million years ago, you have just few remain fossils, and you should reconstruct the whole environment just with these very few remaining things. And what is interesting, that the evidence itself were transformed 5 or 6 times. And nothing is the same as it was like. The same goes to the history, especially to the history of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union itself was rewriting its history 5 or 6 major times, and the Soviet Union of the 20s and the Soviet Union of the 60s, 2 absolutely different states with different ideologies and different heroes. And of course, people themselves were silencing themselves, censoring themselves, and forging the evidence of their of their lives which never existed. But as a person living in Russia, I inherited, let's say, the Soviet Russian language, which will never work as a mean of exploration of this, because it's like to put 2 mirrors in front of each other. They will just reflect one mirror inside the mirror. It will be just a disaster. So my idea was not only to, let's say, discover the shadows, but to offer the language. Brodsky did it in the poetry. He confronted, I wouldn't say even he confronted the Soviet language. He wrote like it never existed. It's more difficult in the prose. So my idea was to form the language extremely poetical, because the poetry is the most sensitive mean to go inside the things, and analytical at the same time. Once I asked myself, what will happen if you can imagine that Marcel Proust will write about Gulag? You cannot imagine this, but if. So this was the task, this was the idea. And when it goes to the north, north for me is the symbol of the great absence. It's just a condensed nothing, condensed absence. And when the people were sent to this absence, to the kingdom of the permafrost, it's extremely difficult to bring them back, because even their death happened not in the, let's say, cultural environment of the country, in the, let's say, general necropolis of the country. It happened somewhere, without any witness, without any link. And for me, they're still in this permafrost. There is the moment without time, and the idea of all this text for time to begin. This is the major task for the prose, I think.
But this is something that I was that hit me when I was reading Oblivion, and you use the metaphor of time, or actually rocks being compressed time, and then you, as yourself being a geologist, you sort of investigate time, which has been compressed to hard rock. And what we both do, I was thinking, in that is that these bubbles of air, that's the ones we're looking for, where something opens up, where something is still left. Yeah. So that I could see very many similarities in our approach, investigative journalism working with poetry, yes.
In a text that was just published in English, it was published in Russian a while ago. It's about, perhaps we'll talk more about it a little bit later. It's about a Russian researcher and geologist who's prosecuted in Russia for pedophilia, among other things.
But he's innocent.
As a staged prosecution. Yuri Dmitriev. You talk about these places as which he also examines, traces, searches for findings that say something about the past. You describe it as if they, up until then, they have only existed in geography, not in history, which means that what you're doing is so to say, bestowing these places with the history and with the destiny as well, right?
It's very interesting because not only this mass graves and mass place of mass executions, all the, let's say, Soviet civilization and infrastructure in the north have no history beneath. It all appeared from the camp barracks. All these cities are like 50 years old, 60 years old, and nothing is beneath. So when you are trying to, how to say, to work with the memory of these places, you have nothing to attach yourself except the camp memory. They are born from this. And of course, the places which are just in taiga or tundra, they have no, how to say, links or relations at all. And it's because of this, it's very comfortable or easy to forget them. Even the names, you cannot give them any name because there is no topography, there is no marks on the land nearby, no cities, no villages, just nothing. And really to bring the history in these places and to bring these places to major history, to European, let's say, history. This is the huge task because the oblivion starts when the main hero is standing on the border of the Portuguese looking to the Atlantic Ocean. And this was my real experience because suddenly I understood that I'm standing in this place and I know the other side of Europe, which ends on the Urals. And this is the one continent, one fate, and one history. And I should make this different sides of Europe a little bit closer with the book, like a bridge.
No, I was just thinking because we can say a lot of things about Russia, but neither Soviet Russia or present Russia are the only ones writing and rewriting its history, of course, and wanting to do that with certain political purposes, and we are doing it, and that is also one of the things that are very evident here with the Nuremberg trials that are at their height in 1947, because they, of course, highlight some parts of what have just happened, and they consciously choose to neglect others. And quite a lot are actually in the dark with a specific political purpose. Different purposes from the different allies, but that's, I think, one of the reasons we still have to deal with the Second World War and the genocide, because so much was buried on purpose, and people wanted to forget. The perpetrators wanted to forget, the victims wanted to forget, and in order to go on, people had to put this somewhere else, below their consciousness. So that's why we still are working on this theme.
And still there are a lot of job ahead.
There's a
lot, exactly.
A lot to be done. But this is what you're both doing. You're also using the past to say something actually about the present. There is an equivalent book in your oeuvre, which is The Year of the Comet, which is where the year is 1986, not 1947 this year, but 1986. Halley's comet is
came again,
seen across the sea. But that's a starting point for post-Soviet Russia, but it's also an ending point of Soviet history, this 1986. But also in this book, which is new out in German, this is about the 1990s in Russia. But you're writing about the 1990s, but you're writing about Russia today through the 1990s. I would ask you to read an excerpt from this book.
Yeah, just a small foreword for this excerpt. When I was working on the North, again to the North, there was a very common legend among the folks that the Stalinist camps were closed, but not forever. They're preserved for the future. And once, if it will be necessary again, they will be just opened and filled again with the prisoners. So Gulag is like in oblivion, but Gulag never ends. And in the end of the Soviet time and in the beginning of this new Russian era, it was also the rumors that already camps are preparing to be opened again. So this 1991 was just a tricky game, and everything will come back again. Soviet Union will come back again. So this is just an excerpt about this story and about this legend, how I witnessed it.
And one has to say, I think the protagonist in this is called the dog Tsar, the Wounded Sow, and he is a former guard in this camp. Or he's actually still a guard when it starts.
Then came the coup attempt in Moscow, and 18 months later there were delays in paying the guards. The dog Tsar started poaching in order to feed his dogs, and he almost shot the forest ranger who caught him over the bodies of 2 elk, still warm. Never sociable, he spoke even more rarely with the other officers. He spent more and more time with the dogs, and if consulting them on how to go on, trying to stand how the dogs accepted the new times and what they sensed in the future. The dog Tsar refused to leave when the colony was closed down. First, he wrote letters to higher-ups, thinking that they must not know, otherwise how could this hideous mistake be explained? Then he realized that the generals considered the colony unneeded, that the other parallel colonies were enough, and from that moment he didn't believe that the state was the state or police chiefs were police chiefs. He thought that there had been a substitution, everything was fake, and he had to reach someone who, like him, could still see the truth. They didn't train well, and only few could stand being on a chain. Yes, he was a dog Tsar, and the dogs obeyed him just as much as there were dog blood in them. But the wolf blood didn't obey, for he was not the wolf Tsar.
One can choose, of course, how far one wants to take this allegoric story and put it over historical or contemporary Russia. We'll not do that now. We're running a little bit out of time, and we will try to get as many questions as possible. But before we do that, I would like to talk to Elisabeth and Sergej about another part of their work, because there are not only 2 former or current investigative journalists sitting here and 2 writers, but also 2 public intellectuals and intellectuels engagés. Elisabeth is a is the president of the Swedish PEN and a constant and loud voice in the Swedish public sphere. Sergei has spoken up numerous times about contemporary Russia, but has especially gotten engaged in this case of Yuri Dmitriev, which a case that will be come to a close quite soon. Hopefully, one could say. But so I wanted to just briefly touch upon these two these activities of yours. And with you, Elisabeth, I would like to talk to you a little bit about something that has occupied the Swedish public sphere for a year and a half, roughly, and which culminated a couple of weeks ago about a month ago, in connection with the Gothenburg Book Fair. Could you present the problem the Swedes are facing?
Well, difficult, but it came up to surface with the Gothenburg Book Fair, one could say, which is a very important place, an arena for writers and the audience. It's a big audience book fair, open to the public. Anyway, a right-wing extremist paper applied to take part of it and were allowed in. And that started a protest among writers, and it became a boycott, where people said that if this right-wing extremist paper is there, we won't go. And to make a very long story a bit shorter, I ended up talking about the importance of being there. Not in spite of this right-wing extremist paper, but because they were there. Because, in my point of view, boycotting because of their presence was handing them all the power. They made about 200 people, several members of the Swedish Academy, the ones who deal the Nobel Prize of Literature, they made them boycott the book fair, which gave them an enormous prestige, that they'd made 200 heavy people move. And I would not let them, with my background, I would not let them move us. And it's the same way, I think, the way we reason when it comes to Islamistic terrorism or whatever terrorism. They want to disturb us, they want to disturb the democratic way of living, and we should not let them. So that was my stance, and I've been argumenting for it. And so that was one thing. But we also have Nazis, hardcore Nazis, on the street. And these two, of course, are connected, even though they're separate. And so in Sweden, there's also a parallel debate of forbid the Nazis to demonstrate, forbid them to have meetings in the public, and all that. And suddenly, I find myself, with my background, standing in interviews defending the Nazis' right to demonstrate, which is a very, very strange situation, but absolutely vital. Because, and here we connect, I think, first of all, there are laws against crimes, hate speech and all that. But the main reason for me defending their right to demonstrate is that if we start to forbid everything we don't like, we are on a slippery slope towards a totalitarian way of thinking. That is the totalitarian way of thinking, to take away all that we hate. And that is not the democratic way. So in order to protect democracy, we have to deal in another way with anti-democratic movements and ideologies than trying to extinct them that way, by forbidding them. That was the extremely short version.
It's a short version of something that both of us have been in the very middle of. But it's also, you could see it at the Frankfurt Book Fair this year. You will for sure see it at the Leipzig Book Fair in spring. This is something that every society and especially a writer's community, as people dealing with ideas and the written word, will have to face and deal with and try to come up with a certain approach to this. And Elisabeth has described one radical defense of free speech, and there are the 250 other writers that came up with another one, namely out of fear for these utterances that you don't like and that you fear, boycott. So, and these are the things that are up there. Sergei, your case is a little bit, it's a different one. It involves one particular person, and I'm referring now to Yuri Dmitrieva. But it's part of a structure that is, again, based on fear or fear-mongering. Could you very briefly describe what it is, take this as a platform also to describe this case?
When we in Russia are trying to deal with the Stalinist repression, we mainly rely on absolute symbolical things. You know, the monument in Moscow, and where actually these people were shot, what happens there, nobody cares. So in a way it's not honest to do these things. It reminds me of the Soviet culture of World War II. Huge monuments and the fate of the soldiers, nobody cares. So Yuri Dmitriev is the only living field researcher of the mass executions far away on the north. It makes him extremely unique person. And he finds the very great way to deal with these places. No monopoly for the state. He finds the full lists of the names. He finds the relatives and invites them to come, to share, to do something. This made him extremely dangerous person for the state. And as it happened in the 80s, where dissidents were not accused of being dissidents, but they were accused of drug trafficking, rapes, blah, 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 and so on, he was accused of producing the children pornography, which is, you know. And this was the, how to say, the red line for a lot of people, because he is super honest and super important figure. And we cannot say just, okay, it's another trial. It's really the Stalinist successors came to jail the only person who stands for their victims, literally stands for their victims, not in a literal or symbolical way, but just he's digging these graves. And so it happened that as a writer who writes about Gulag, and as a man, the person who shared these places with Dmitriev, because I worked there as geologist, I understood that, okay, it's my cause. As a journalist, as a, let's say, public person. And since then, for 1 year, I'm inside the case. And
which is also something that Ken has picked up on. Actually, as he's seen as he's seen as an intellectual as well, not only as a researcher.
Definitely. Well, I mean, he is. He's part of the public debate, and he's doing exactly what a lot of intellectuals and writers do: deal with the collective memory and collective oblivion, of course. So it's evident. Yeah.
So I would open up the floor now for questions. And as Walter said at the beginning, you can also post the questions in German. That's not a problem at all. It's important to use the microphones, though, and also just to say who you are would be great as well.
I can, yes, or you can translate.
Yeah, maybe? I can translate.
These are terrible.
I won't give up that easily.
It's early in the morning.
There you go. It's always a good tactic to wait a little bit. Yes, please in the back there.
Microphone?
And you other can then summon some courage and in the meantime.
Hallo. Ist das Mikrofon an? Ja, genau, okay. Mein Name ist Veronika Trubel. Ich habe gestern die ELIUB Jugendbegegnung, eine Jugendkonferenz hier gehabt, wo wir auch das Thema der Toleranz und der Intoleranz als eines unserer großen Themen hatten. Und deshalb wollte ich an die Frau Åsbrink eine Frage stellen, die damit im Zusammenhang steht. Nämlich wir haben über das Toleranzparadoxon von Karl Popper gesprochen, wo es heißt, sinngemäß, wenn die Toleranz die Intoleranz toleriert, führt das letztlich und zulässt, führt das letztlich dazu, dass die Toleranz untergeht und die Toleranten mit ihnen. Und Sie haben jetzt etwas ganz anderes dazu gesagt. Das finde ich sehr interessant. Und wir haben ja jetzt auch viele junge Leute hier und jetzt wollte ich Sie bitten, das ein bisschen näher vielleicht zu erklären, was Sie da meinen.
So, a very brief summary of that. Yesterday, at the youth activities of this festival as well, tolerance were discussed, also in the terms of Karl Popper's dictum that when the tolerant start to tolerate intolerance, tolerance will disappear. And this is the same thing as you said before about the enemies of how does democracy deal with the enemies of democracy? And you presented a completely different approach than Karl Popper suggested, and interesting. What do you want to say about that?
Well, there's so many things to say about this. One of the things with the first book I wrote about the play, the Swedish playwright who put two Nazis on stage and had an audience buy tickets, look at the theatre and applaud, which created very strong feelings. Should one applaud Nazi ideology? Could one take Nazis on the stage in the cultural environment? But the important thing is, did the applause, did the appreciation, the listening, did it make them more Nazi, or did it actually change them into becoming a bit more democratic? Actually, it seemed like the hatred towards them made them more violent Nazis. So, the conclusions to draw by this, I leave to anyone. This is an open question. But when historians look at the vital question of the genocide of the European Jews, homosexuals, Romas, mentally ill. The question that comes back all the time is, how could ordinary people commit these crimes? How could it happen? Were they extreme Nazis? Would they be killed if they said no? And a lot of research has been done, and yes, most of the people who did the most barbaric actions, they were not SS, they were not extreme Nazis, and they were not punished if they said no. They were there on their own will. And this, for instance, goes for the groups working in Soviet, the Einsatzgruppe. And there's, for instance, an historian, Christopher Browning, one of the most acknowledged. He's written a book about one of these groups in the Einsatzgruppe. It's called Ordinary Men. It's a short book. I recommend anyone to read it. And what his answer to this question, how come these ordinary men, they were mailmen, they were shopkeepers, they were just ordinary family fathers. How come they did these incredibly barbaric things in Soviet? Well, the only thing he comes up with is the group dynamic and the fact that only one thought, one view, one opinion was allowed. So it was a social pressure and a group dynamic. And the conclusion one can draw from that is that we need to let a lot of opinions come out. The multiplying of opinions, if we oppress opinions that we don't accept, we are in deep trouble. The way of saving democracy is having a multitude of voices, a multitude of experiences, and a multitude of words, languages, and voices, as I said. So that was a very long answer to your question, but hopefully.
But to make that also even longer, one has to stress, I think, that even if it might seem as if you are, so to say, on the tolerant side here, one has to interpret this tolerant in a very specific way, because you are a strong and ardent defender and opponent to these ideas and argue against them, which
I can say
this does not, so to say,
no.
Fit within that tolerance concept.
No,
just so
no,
that's
definitely
very clear.
not. No, this is interesting because I think Popper is interesting, but I'm not. I mean, in a way, I agree with him because we do have regulations in Europe, in most countries, against hate speech, and this is very interesting because it's where we put down the line where words become criminal actions. Until that line, words, opinions, thoughts are not criminal, but when we cross that line, they become criminal acts. So this is a very interesting, and different countries put that line in different places. I'm for that. There is a line where words become criminal acts. So I agree with Popper in a way. Yeah.
Yes. Sergei, the freedom of speech thing, the right-wing extremism, right-wing populism in Europe, Russia is not completely innocent in that respect. It becomes clearer and clearer.
It's more and more reminds me about the 30s, about the Comintern structure, with this, how to say, communist headquarters near the Kremlin, which conducted the actions of the different communist parties in the different countries of Europe, with their own Comintern radio station, newspapers, and so on. Of course, it's not as evident now. There is no Comintern 2.0 headquarters near Kremlin. But of course, as we can see from their own media, and the whole stake is to divide Europe, of course. And every sign of European Union shaking or shivering is celebrated like it's okay, the thunderstorm is coming. And when it will come, there will be no solid power, and we will finally negotiate some kind of peace about the annexed Crimea, Ukraine, and so on. I had very strange experiences in the different countries also, because of course, outside of Russia, they deeply observe what is said, what is told, how Russia is depicted. And they don't care what is told about Russia inside Russia. It's all controlled. But outside, they invest so much money in this Russia Today and all these things. And they still are dependent from the Europe. They're still dependent from US in terms of money, technologies, and so on. But on the other hand, of course, the right-wing things is the most interesting and dangerous topics, because I know that some literary agents were trying to order the book about this topic, about Russian involvement in this. And even the best Russian investigative journalists refused, because it seems that it's the hottest thing and most dangerous thing, as, for example, 15 years ago the Chechen War was. And the danger is too high, even for the super professionals.
It's very difficult to do justice to such fantastic books as these two. And we have had a very, very broad discussion about a lot of different things. It's time for us to end now, and I would like us to applaud the protagonists. Yeah. Thanks.